Hi, this is Pierre Sabak, and today I've got James Bartley. And now James Bartley is known for his work with MILAB abductees and also his work in the reptilian conspiracy. Now, this is really where I came to know James's work, because I became aware of your work about 10 years ago, at least a decade, possibly longer, because I was researching about the seraphim and the reptilians, or the jinn, and the occult tradition behind that. So I came to your work with that perspective. And now I've been re-looking at your work in order to do this interview, and I think what's fascinating about your work is just how expansive it is, because you look at ufology, you're looking at the reptilian aspect, MILAB, but there's also a strong political element as well. And so you're talking about the geopolitical aspects of aliens and how they intervene and interact within human society, and also the political level, and to a degree, the symbolism behind that, or shall we say the semiotics or the deconstruction of the sign. So I think that your research is absolutely fascinating, because you're one of only very few researchers who are really beginning to piece together and integrate all these different areas, whether it's the political aspect or whether it's the alien aspect, and how all that pieces together in a very sophisticated and a very complex way. Now, to start this interview, I want to talk about your early life and what really made the man, because I'm very curious about how you came to be, and in terms of whether you had interactions when you were very young, or whether you was interested in the occult or in ghosts or in the bogeyman, and how this interest really developed. So if we could start there, and then we could then obviously take it out to more recent work, or your interests, or where you would like to develop some of your arguments. So yeah, let's start with the early you and how this all started.
Well, thank you, Pierre. I'm really pleased to be here and excuse me, be able to share with your audience. For me, it started in childhood, like with so many others who had ET experiences. I've always been something of a reader, and at an early age, when I learned how to read, I immersed myself in a number of books, and I was immediately drawn to Greek mythology, immediately drawn to Roman history, Greek history, Egyptology, if you will. And granted, a lot of it was standard mainstream information, but it gave a good grounding. And unlike kids today, back then, of course, there was no internet. And the people, not only in our peer group, kids the same age as me, but our elders, if you will, were all interested in history back then. It seemed to me that way anyway. So whether it was elder siblings, older uncles, or friends of the family, there was usually someone around who would talk about the past. And because my family is of Filipino ethnicity for the most part, a lot of the stories around the house were about World War II, or about the occupation of the Philippines by the Japanese. My father was a Vietnam vet. He was in the Brown Water Navy, patrolling up and down the Mekong Delta and other places in these small patrol boats. And my grandfather and some of my other ancestors were in the Filipino resistance movement, in the guerrillas, fighting against the Japanese. So these were the stories I grew up with. So on the one hand, I was deeply interested in Greek mythology, which I must add, from the beginning, I never viewed Greek mythology as being something fantastical or unbelievable. To me, I always felt a resonance of truth in it. There was something about it that was compelling. There was something about it that had a deep inner meaning to me. And so I would immerse myself in reading about the gods and the goddesses, the Olympian gods and goddesses, and their various manifestations. They seem to be shapeshifters, a term we would use nowadays. And they seem to have this abiding interest in interfering with the humanity at large. And so on the one hand, I'm thoroughly grounded for the most part. To be sure, we didn't have a complete understanding of even recent World War II history, but myself and the kids my age, we were readers back then. I mean, the big event in our lives was almost daily trips to the library. And combined with what we heard from our elders, which is in stark contrast to today, because even adults nowadays, unlike yourself, Pierre, a lot of people just simply surf the net. They're not into the old school book learning, which I always preach, that if you want to get into ufology, if you want to study the history of aliens and UFOs and UFO investigations, to immerse oneself in the books. And it may seem tedious. Some of the books seem repetitive with endless number of sightings, endless number of encounters, but really that's where the grounding takes place. So me and my peers would talk about military history. We would talk about Roman history. We would talk about the Roman Empire rather. We would talk about the wars between Carthage and Rome, and we were just kids. And the kids in those days, we didn't have video games. We played chess. So we were into strategy games. And that was kind of our grounding. And as time went on, I began to have a number of experiences. And this was starting at an early age. There was one experience where in my bedroom in Texas, my dad was in, at that point, he was stationed on a number of naval air stations and also on aircraft carriers. He became part of the naval aviation side of things from the ground perspective. And so we had moved from California to Texas, the Gulf of Mexico, Corpus Christi area in particular. There's two air stations there, or there were, Naval Air Station Corpus Christi and Naval Air Station, later Naval Air Facility, Kingsville. And my dad had worked at both bases. And when we lived there, this had to be, I couldn't have been more than 5 years old, maybe earlier. I remember it distinctly because it was sometime in the autumn or the winter, because my mother was in the living room and she was ironing my dad's seaman's uniform. And the uniform was the dark navy blue uniform, which told me that the time of year would have been autumn or winter in the northern hemisphere. And my dad was at work at the airbase. I was in my bedroom playing. I don't know where my older brother and older sister were. I'm not sure if my younger brother had joined us yet. If he did, he would have been an infant. So I'm in my bedroom, it's dusk, and I remember distinctly, I had Venetian blinds, and coming in through the waning rays of the sunlight, I could see the dust motes hanging in the air, and I'm playing in my room. And I was always one of those introverted kids that I could occupy myself endlessly. To this day, I could just lose myself in a good book and just tune the world out if I need to. So I'm in there playing by myself, just occupying myself. And then I felt and noticed a presence, and I turned around, and there was this small being that was essentially floating in the air. And from my I was always a small underage kid too. I heard all the derogatory slurs. I was a shrimp, I was a midget, etc., etc. So the perspective I had was it was much smaller than me. I would say, with an adult perspective, I would say this being was about 3.5 feet in height total, and it was floating, and it was brown, and it had wrinkled skin. It did not have an oversized head, kind of a narrow head, but not overly narrow, roundish eyes. If one can find the book by Katarina Wilson, Alien Jigsaw, a researcher supplement. I believe it was her second book. She has a drawing there of what she referred to as I think a type 3 gray. And that pretty much accurately depicts, aside from the color, the being that I saw, which was brown and its skin was kind of mottled and wrinkled. And being a possessive kid, I didn't like intruders around. My bedroom was my domain. So I confronted this being and I said, "What are you doing here? This is my room. These are my toys," essentially. Right? And then the being started talking to me telepathically. And much further down the track, we hear this again and again where alien abductees or people that report frequent encounters or semi-frequent encounters with ETs, or at least non-human beings, sometimes they're told something along the lines of, you have a destiny to fulfill, you're going to be knowing and doing things in the future, the work you're going to be doing is important, etc., etc. Well, that's what this little beings are telling me telepathically. You have a destiny to fulfill. In so many words, you're going to be doing something very important. You're going to learn who you are in the overall scheme of things. And I'm paraphrasing here by memory. Of course, none of this didn't register with me. To me, there was just this little intruder, and the fact that it was non-human, that was beside the point. It was just like, what's it doing in my room? Get out of here. So I told this being, I said, I'm going to tell my mother because I want you to leave. And I distinctly remember it saying to me, "Go ahead. She won't see me." So what I did was I walked out of the bedroom and went over to where my mother was ironing my dad's work clothes, and I kept telling her, "Mom, there's this little man in my room. There's a little man in my room." In my childhood vocabulary, that's the only way I could describe this being. And you know, she wasn't having a bar of it. She couldn't be bothered. She's ironing my dad's clothes, work clothes. So I said, Mom, I was persistent. And then I literally grabbed her by the elbow and pulled her towards my bedroom door. I pushed the door completely open and pointed inside triumphantly and, "See, look." And there was nothing in there. The being had disappeared. My mom became upset at me and then stormed off and continued ironing my dad's seamen's clothes. So I go in to the bedroom, I close the door, and then this being just reappears in front of me. And if I didn't know any better, with the benefit of hindsight, it had almost the smug expression of, like, "I told you so." So it looked at me for a little while longer, and then it disappeared. Now, that was when I was in Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico. After that, we moved back to California, this time the San Francisco Bay Area, Daly City, California, which is right next to San Francisco, because my dad was then transferred to Naval Air Station Alameda, which is where they park some of the Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers. And by then I'm in the first grade, the second grade, I'm starting to have friends, right? And I told just about anyone who would listen to me about this encounter I had with this little, what I called, because I did not have the lights on, it was dusk, my room was kind of dim, the only illumination was the sunlight coming in through the Venetian blinds, and like I said, little dust motes floating around. And I kept describing this being, for lack of a better term, as the little gray man. Although, with the benefit of hindsight, it was more brown. But at any rate, I called it and told everyone the little gray man that I had an encounter with. And what was interesting was, at that time, the indoctrination, the spell that's been cast over everyone from, practically from infancy on up to adulthood, to engender the smirking, ridiculing factor that had not really set in yet, especially amongst those kids that I used to hang around with. So nobody ridiculed me, nobody doubted me, nobody thought I was crazy. And what was also interesting, Pierre, was back then, I distinctly remember watching, because we lived in Navy, Marine Corps, and occasionally visiting Air Force personnel dependent housing. We called it the projects. It was right near Midway Elementary School in Daly City. Midway Elementary School was named after the Battle of Midway. I lived on Tarawa Road, which was named after the battle in the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Anyway, so I like I said, I grew up a Navy brat. This is all I heard. This was my life. And I remember a plane flying overhead, an airliner, and I just casually said to the kids around me, these are just kids in a neighborhood that, one day we're going to have, we're going to be living on Mars. There's going to be colonies there. And nobody ridiculed me. Nobody thought it was a crazy, outlandish suggestion. Our minds were much more open back then to all this information. And it was only later when all the indoctrination set in. So for a period of, a few years, I told anyone that was around about this little gray man story. And then inexplicably, Pierre, and this happens, I've spoken to others who've had ET encounters, inexplicably, that seminal event in my life just vanished from my conscious memory. I forgot all about it, which was bizarre considering how obsessed I was about it, basically. And then what happened was, from the early mid-70s, I began having a series of nosebleeds. I'd wake up, my bed would be covered with blood. On one occasion, I remember laying in bed. This was probably around 74, 75 time frame. I remember distinctly the feeling of a long, cold, metallic probe being shoved up my nostril, pushed up, a popping sensation, intense pain, and then blacking out. Waking up the next morning, once again, the pillow just saturated in blood. I began having strange episodes where I slept on the upper bunk of a bunk bed with my older brother below, and they would find me at times everywhere but that upper bunk bed. I used to use a desk to climb up onto the bunk bed, so they would find me laying on the desk. They would find me under the desk. They would find me in the hallway. They'd find me in another room entirely. And they wrote it off, my family, as, I was sleepwalking. I also was doing a lot of sleep talking at the time, what they describe as some strange Oriental sounding language, right? So, and I had a number of experiences, a missing time experience. I was waking up with my night clothes inside out and backwards, and the attached booties, the attached socks, if you will, for the one-piece pajamas that I used to wear a lot. It was gray. I would wake up in the morning and there would be dirt and stickers at the bottom of the sock part, as if I'd been outdoors at night, right? And during that time also, what I was come to understand much later was how dreams and how our subconscious plays such a part of this. So I was having lots of dreams of UFOs, lots of dreams of, and I'm jumping from like the early 70s to the mid 70s here, going into the late 70s when I was in high school. It's out-of-body experiences.
Can I just ask about the dreams? Do you think with the dreams that's a type of projection? It's almost you have a real experience, and then the mind tries to make sense of that and reconfigures that experience as a dream? Or do you think that the dreams were very literal interpretations of what actually occurred? How do you view the dreams?
I think for some people, what some of the abducting aliens do is they impose amnesic barriers, externally imposed amnesia. And in the cases of others, there's some bleed through where the traumatic memories will come forth in a dream, fragmented or otherwise. I think in my case, and in the case of many others, is what this alien intelligence does is, as a form of indoctrination, they do what I call astral dreamscape manipulation, where at an early age they begin conducting stage managed dreams, taking over your dreamscape and showing you a bunch of things, sometimes of a highly symbolic nature, but sometimes It seems as if you're taking on trips, like your consciousness is transported elsewhere and you're shown things. And also, a lot of the dreams would involve like flying saucers, UFOs. And on one occasion in this dream, uh, in 1974-75 timeframe, a gleaming silver saucer landed in the avenue, the very busy avenue, in front of the house my parents lived at in San Jose, California. And me and my brother were inside the house, my younger brother. We're looking out the windows, and the next thing you know, a ramp appears on the side of this craft, and then three large Sasquatch-type beings alight from it, right? And I didn't know at the time that 74, 75, that time frame, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, there was a number of cases where large, hairy hominoids were seen in close proximity to hovering or landed alien craft, right? People were just starting to make that connection in the real world. And here I was, completely oblivious to all that, having dreams about these big, hairy Sasquatch-type beings coming out of craft. So what the aliens, for lack of a better term, can do is they can indoctrinate us, gradually, incrementally, over time, condition us to this otherworldly reality through our dream state.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this. I've been looking at this idea also in terms of mental entrainment, in terms of how they condition the mind, in particular, using particular triggers in order to condition the mind to put a person into certain types of states, in whether this is to transfer information, to make a person more susceptible. So I think that concurs with my research, and I think that's a very in-depth and very full understanding of what is actually occurring, because I think the manipulation is very subliminal, it's very subtle. Again, it involves a lot of symbolism as well, and I think that this is because there is this symbolic component between the symbol and language. And I also think that they're using language in order to manipulate memories as well, so they're inserting words or in order to configure the memory or to reconfigure the memory. And it's very interesting in terms of how your peer group to begin with were very accepting or very receptive in terms of what you were talking about. I mean, I had an experience when I was at school of what looked like a missile, and it was about the third of the size of the classroom, and we had these open windows, and it just flew by. It was silver and red. And I remember I told my friend about this missile, and my friend said, well, last week you talked about seeing a ghost, and this week you've seen a missile, but they're going to think that you're completely crazy. And I think that in itself is kind of interesting, because I mean, I've had experiences myself which I would describe as being supernatural or supernatural-esque. But it's interesting that when I saw this missile that a few weeks earlier, or vice versa, I can't remember which order it was, but I had seen a ghost. And I think that there is this often connection with UFOs and ghosts and spirits. And I think that when they come through whatever type of portal they come through, that in some way, whether it's linked into time travel, if it's linked into spirits, but there seems to be this spiritual dimension, which is very much affixed to this nuts and bolts interpretation. So I think that what you're dealing with is paradoxes and these paradoxical states. Now, what's your interpretation in terms of particularly a manifestation of spirits in conjunction with aliens? Do you have an interpretation on that? And does that impinge or interact with the dream state in some way?
Well, I agree with all of that, Pierre. For a while, I thought I was literally being haunted, because what happens is gradually, incrementally, it seems like there's a paradigm shift, and sometimes it could be quite abrupt. And it seems that whoever are the engineers or the designers of this paradigm shift, it depends. Some people, it's far more abrupt, and I have sympathy for people that have these repeated, in-your-face, full-blown encounters, because I didn't go through that. My experiences were more cyclical. They would cycle back every few years, so I would have time to kind of digest it, or conversely, put this unexplained phenomena into that back burner, that drawer labeled "can't understand it, we'll worry about it later" kind of thing. So for a time, I literally thought I was being haunted because I was having so many paranormal, ghostly events, to the point my mother tried to raise me as a Catholic, but I rebelled. I made such a nuisance of myself in Texas that, and I embarrassed the family a few times, that they just stopped taking me to Catholic church, which is a good thing. And don't want to offend any Catholics out there, but anyway, nevertheless, when I was in the midst of all these strange phenomena, and this by now I'm fast forwarding to my high school years, I kept a crucifix sitting on top of a Bible next to my bed because I literally thought I was being haunted. Like, for example, people, my parents, when they would sit at the countertop in the kitchen, they would look through the what used to be the window into the backyard, but they built an addition behind that. And my bedroom was part of that addition. It was a separate annex to it. So they could sit there at the kitchen counter and look through the window and see my bedroom. And on one occasion, I walked up to them from another part of the house, and they became spooked. They go, "What happened? What happened? Didn't you just walk out of that bedroom? You just came out of the bedroom, didn't you?" "No, that wasn't me. I was over here in the garage," right? So, and even our dog, our German Shepherd Mac, was having encounters with this, what my mom described as a tall man with dark hair and sometimes wearing a suit. So, and on one occasion, check this out. I was going to meet some friends. It was a nice sunny day. I think it was a weekend, Saturday or Sunday. We're going to meet at a park, me and my mates, and we're going to have a few beers and throw a baseball around, whatever, listen to a baseball game. So my bedroom door on the inside had a deadbolt, right? You had to slide it in to the left and then, push the thing downwards to lock it from the inside, right? So I remember closing the door behind me, unable to lock it because the locking mechanism was inside. And then I closed the door, and then behind me, I can hear the deadbolt slide over and lock itself. And then I tried to open it. It wouldn't work. So I go, well, I'm not going to worry about this now. I'll figure it out later. So I come home later, and then what I did, Pierre, was I literally had to take the door off the hinges in order to get back inside. And then once I did that, then I had to kind of, in my mind, because with me, there was always this kind of push and pull aspect. I had found myself at times immersed in, for lack of a better term, phenomena, paranormal stuff, ghostly visitations, UFO sightings, etc. And on the other hand, there was that logical Mr. Spock side of me that there was internal conflict going on for a long time. So what I did was, once I got back inside my room and then I put the door back on its hinges, I began closing and slamming the door at various speeds to see if I could reproduce that effect where the bolt slides over and locks itself, right? And after about 15 minutes thereabouts, I just chalked it up as some more phenomena. And here's another thing. And whoever these tricksters are, Pierre, one can say they have a warped sense of humor, right? I had decided on a particular day to, because even back then I had, a large library, right, a collection of books. So I wanted to organize them, make my room tidier, right? So what I did was I began, arranging the books and tidying up my bedroom. And I had, and Americans would be familiar with this, I had these long necks of Budweiser. There was the regular size bottles, and then there were the long necks, which required a bottle opener, right? And I still have it today. I have this bottle opener that looks like a totem pole, right? And I've had this bottle opener for eons, even back then. It was one of my trademarks, right? So I'm using this bottle opener to pop open these tall neck Budweiser beers. And then, while I'm fixing up my room, and what happened was I finished my beer, and then I went to the kitchen, I grabbed another tall neck, I came back, and then the bottle opener, which I had left right on the table, had disappeared. And long story short, I guess it sounds kind of obsessive compulsive, I tore that room apart. I literally moved the mattresses and the box springs out the door looking for this thing, right? Finally, I gave up. And then I went to the kitchen. I came back. I brought a can opener that has the bottle opening hinge at the end. I came back into the bedroom, and sitting right on the desk in the center of it was the bottle opener, right? After I ripped apart the room. And here's another experience, right? And I believe all this was meant to deal with the Mr. Spock side of me that always had to look at things in a logical way. It was meant to incrementally, gradually, at times abruptly, break that whole paradigm down. Right? And I've since read books like Michael Talbot's excellent books, The Holographic Universe, Beyond the Quantum, which doesn't really explain the dynamics and mechanics behind this. And then one has to have a diverse understanding and exposure to a lot of different source materials. I found that too many of these UFO researchers are very single-minded. They're very tunnel vision orientated, where they refuse to look into like Native American mysticism or Australian Aboriginal mysticism or Greek mythology, whatever the case may be. They're very nuts and bolts orientated. And on this occasion, I was in my bedroom. I had so many experiences in that bedroom. At one time I woke up, I was suspended above my bed with my white bed sheet hanging down from me, and then I was pulled through the roof and taken away in an abduction. But anyway, what I used to do, Pierre, was I used to set a chair next to my bed, and I would place a glass of water in the center of the chair. And I would lay there and I would be reading. And on that particular day, I remember distinctly, I was reading the memoirs of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who was an outstanding field commander for the Germans in World War II. And it was a book called Lost Victories. So, I had drank most of the water. By this point, there was only about that much water and little bits of ice in the bottom of the glass. And I reached over as I'm laying there to grab this glass of water. The glass of water jumps in the air and then falls down, onto the carpet below. Now, there was only a small amount of water, tiny bits of ice. I didn't worry about it. It wasn't juice. It wasn't going to be a sticky mess. I wasn't worried about it. Okay, so I just continued reading. And then after, reading several more pages, I decided, okay, time to stop being lazy. It's time to pick up this glass, right? So as I roll over onto my right to reach down and grab the glass, I notice the glass sitting there in the center of the chair. And then I reach down and I feel down where it landed, and it was completely dry. Again, an inexplicable event. By that point, I've had so many of these bizarre experiences.
Yeah, I seem to recall with Talbot, with the holographic universe, there was a case of objects just materializing in front of his eyes like noodles, and they would just be floating in the air and then would just fall on him, and they would just appear out of nowhere. I think what's interesting about Talbot was that he died of leukemia, and I'm just wondering whether some of these materializations and dematerializations had some kind of negative effect on his body, or even on his auric or electrical field as well, because I think that's really what it probably does. It scrambles the field in some way. Because I've kind of looked at the jinn and I've also looked at the demonic, and I think that all of these different subject areas, whether it's poltergeist, whether it's the demonic, whether it's the jinn, whether it's the fairies, that there are these points of comparison within the data, these data points. So I think that's very interesting about what you're saying in terms of activities, which they traverse all of the different borders, don't they, from what you would describe as a traditional extraterrestrial, if you want to define it that way. But again, the being was also very similar to a type of gnome as well, in some respects. But then you've also got activity which is much more poltergeist-like as well. When these things were occurring, and I know I've had strange things that have occurred to me, and it's kind of like you say, okay, yes, that's interesting, and then you just forget about it and you just go on with your life. And again, you try and find rational explanations for it. So for me, I would wear a locket around my neck with a type of stone, and what would happen would be that this stone would just like come off from my necklace, and it'd be underneath my cushion, or it'd be underneath my mattress, or it'd be just somewhere on the bed. And I'd always be thinking, well, okay, I've got a chain and it's got a lock on, but I never take it off. Maybe somehow it could have unlocked itself and then locked itself and it could have fallen off. So you're always trying to find that explanation. So that rational side of the mind is always working, and that's always trying to find explanations. But like yourself, because I was very well read into ufology, because I'd seen a rocket as a young child, shall I say that I had a very open mind about what was occurring in terms of that I'm very open-minded about the supernatural. So it was like, okay, that's strange. And I would try and find explanations for what was occurring, but then I would just move on with my life. It didn't really faze me that much. I think it spooked out my wife more, because there was a time when we were chatting, and then I said, oh, that's strange, those footsteps walking up the steps. It just sounds like that there's a person walking up our steps. Do you think that's our neighbour? And somehow the sound is echoing in a strange way. And my wife said, what are you talking about, footsteps? And I said, those footsteps. And she said, well, I didn't hear anything. And I said, you haven't heard anything? And she said, no. And I said, well, I hear these footsteps all the time. You know, maybe I'm hearing them 5 times a week or something like this, very regularly, during the day, in the evenings. And she said, I've never heard this. And what was very interesting, and we'd been living there for about 8, 9 years, and she'd never ever heard these footsteps, and I'd been hearing them regularly all the time. Now, once I told her this, it completely stopped. I never heard them again. And again, it's kind of fitting into the poltergeist, it's fitting into the supernatural, but we are really dealing with something which is just natural. The supernatural is just something which is not, shall we say, readily explainable by the scientific paradigm, but I do believe that it can be deconstructed through science. So these experiences, they continued for you, and were there any momentous experiences which really began to get you thinking about this subject, or where you began to think, well, hold on, maybe I should really be studying this and trying to understand this better? Were there pivotal moments, or was it a gradual, incremental moments?
It was both, but like you said, the problem, especially growing up, going into my adolescent, preteen, teen years, all the hormones raging, peer pressure, the difficulty of being able to place these various and sundry paranormal events in a sort of conceptual framework is the problem, where it's far easier and more convenient to just shunt these various experiences into that back corner, back burner of our mind, like, too strange, don't worry about it, you know. So gradually, incrementally over time, these things just continue and continue. Like when I was a kid, for example, although I stated earlier that I was never ridiculed for my beliefs and saying these things, I was under the mistaken impression, Pierre, that everybody experienced phenomena. So when I mentioned to my friends that I was having all these ghostly experiences and seeing UFOs and this kind of stuff, I just took it as an article of faith that they were experiencing these things too. And it became quite a shock to me to realize, at least at a conscious level, now that I understand these things better, they were not having these things happen to them. And that created a sense of isolation within me. And I was already kind of a taciturn kind of boy then, where unless I'm prompted, I don't really say much to anybody, right? It's just my nature. But there were some key moments over time, formative experiences, what began happening, and I've since come to understand this is part and parcel of the phenomena for many, was I began having a lot of out-of-body experiences. But like I said earlier, I'm the kind of guy, when I have things happen to me, I'm compelled to do the reading about it. I'm compelled to go to bookstores. I'm compelled to go to libraries. So I began having all these out-of-body experiences, and I began reading Robert Monroe's books, the classic Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, et cetera, et cetera. And I've since come to understand that some of those out-of-body experiences were deliberately triggered and instigated by the ETs themselves. Because there were times when I'd be laying in bed, in my bedroom as a teenager, and I'd feel the sensation of heat, but it wasn't anything that I could feel on my skin or on my body. It was more a sensation in the environment itself. And it created a sense of restlessness in me where I could not relax enough to fall asleep. Long story short, and also it would be accompanied at times by a high-pitched tone in my head or my ears. And on one occasion, I saw a very large bluish-white circle that was cast onto the wall, which then changed into a large triangle. And I could no longer ignore it. I mean, I literally turned my back on it, right, because I didn't want to look at this thing. Eventually, my curiosity got the best of me. Then I got out of bed to take a look at this lighted large triangle on my wall and found my face inches away from the wall instantly. And I turned around to look, and there's my physical body laying there. Oh, I'm out of my body, right? So those kinds of things happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've only had one out-of-body experience, and I don't really know if it was an out-of-body experience because basically I fell asleep, although that's what it seemed like, and then I was out of my body, and I could control whether I could go up or down. And I was watching the television. At the time, there was it wasn't Thomas the Tank Engine, but it was a children's program. Ivor the Engine, that was it, because my son was very young. And I remember kind of floating upwards, and I was touching the ceiling, the artexing, and I could feel it physically. So it seemed to me that I was actually floating, and that this was a physical experience, that it wasn't spiritual. And I was kind of curious about it. I didn't feel afraid. But sometimes I think with these experiences, the fear factor just doesn't exist. It's almost like that part has been deleted or manipulated in some way. So there was just this innate curiosity about the experience. And then gradually I felt as though I was getting heavier and heavier, and I gradually came back to my body. And yeah, that was a curious experience. But have you come across experiences like that where it's been physical, where the person who was floating could touch the environment and feel the environment and feel physical?
I've heard of such cases of people being levitated involuntarily. In my case, there was the times that I mentioned earlier where I was pulled through my ceiling. So I was physical, but I was in the process of, lack of a better term, being made to dematerialize, or at least less densified so I can go through the ceiling. Also, there were times when I know I was out of my body and I tried to pass through a window or a wall, but I could still feel the graininess, for lack of a better term, the texture of the window, the glass, and or the wall that I was trying to go through. And sometimes I was not able to go through. I had to back out and then just kind of float around in my bedroom. And other times when I'd actually project, I'd just hop clear over into some other place, some other dimension, for lack of a better term. And there were times, on one occasion, I remember being out of my body. I could literally see, and even the ancients have talked about this shining, shimmering silver cord that came out of my solar plexus area and connected to my physical body. I remember floating around above. This thing was, this connection was between me and my body was there, and it was bright, and it was silvery, and it was shimmering. And what I've since come to find out also, and many others have found out who've done alien abduction research, is we not only get abducted physically, but we do get abducted astrally as well, or our soul matrix consciousness, whatever one wants to call it, the ability that some of these beings have to take it out of our physical body and transport it elsewhere. Sometimes put us in a virtual environment kind of scenario where we're exposed to all kinds of things, much of it sometimes of a highly symbolic nature. And I think there's a lot of mysticism, for lack of a better term, that in the olden times they would have thought of in terms of mystics and mysticism. There's that element of this too. It's very much this the hero-heroine's journey kind of thing, Pierre, where so many of our paradigms, the old self, if you will, goes through this disintegration, death process, and out of it is forged this new aspect of ourselves with a greater understanding. And so I came to understand, long before I read Michael Talbot's books and other similar books, that we are more than corporeal physical beings, that for lack of a better term, a term that David Icke popularized, we are multidimensional beings by nature. And I think, I don't mean this in an elitist sense, Pierre, but I think that due to the hybridization factor, due to the fact that certain ET, subterrestrial, interdimensional, it's not mutually exclusive, some beings represent all three, because of their long-standing genetic interest, influence on certain bloodlines. DNA is a transceiver. It's a sender and receiver information, and it's crystalline in nature. And so I do believe that, and I say this not in an elitist sense, that some people have more of an attuned antenna, if you will. Like in your case, where you were hearing footsteps, where some people have the ability to see in the periphery of their vision, or even straight on, because they have the enhanced etheric third eye vision. They can see essentially what other people cannot see. They can see into other worlds, other realms, other dimensions. And this goes back to the mystical traditions, right? So there's that element of it too. And one of the formative experiences I had was, besides that out-of-body experience I mentioned earlier, was a 1990 rolled around. Now, it must be understood that psychically, every few years before that, I would once again have a series of experiences, UFO dreams, out-of-body experiences, missing time experiences, but nothing that I could really hang my hat on. I was always interested in UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, all that stuff. It was, as well as being interested in military history, from antiquity to modern times, and that plays a role in this too. So I was in Germany in the summer of 1990. It was a German language immersion course, right? And I was over there to learn the language, as much of it as I could. And I lived in a small village right on the banks of the Rhine River. And across that river was a larger Swiss town by the same name, right? And I lived in a large guest house. Anyway, long story short, as my time came closer to depart and go back to California, about 2 weeks before I was scheduled to go back, I began having that creepy crawly feeling of being watched, of being under observation again, as I had in my youth. And I began sleeping with the lights on, right, which I used to do. I mean, I was so skittish when I was a boy, Pierre. I would lay beneath a mound of blankets, of pillows. I would create a little air pocket for myself. And then when the air would grow stale, I would lift up, the blanket and stick my mouth out and draw in a deep breath in it, and with the lights on, right? And I used to set all these booby traps up in my bedroom, all this yarn and string and toys that would come swinging down, right? It's because I felt like I was under I was in a siege situation, it seemed to me. I just couldn't quantify it. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I just knew at some level it seemed like I was being attacked. So anyway, here I am, a young adult, 25 years old thereabouts, and getting ready to go back to California. And then a couple of weeks before going back, I started getting that creepy feeling again, start sleeping with my lights on again. And where I lived was right on the edge of the Black Forest, okay? Think Hansel and Gretel and the Grimm's fairy tales and all that stuff. And this is how skittish I'd gotten. There's a stretch along the Rhine River where they made the foliage kind of into a tunnel. So for about, 100 feet, as you're walking along this footpath along the banks of the Rhine, you have to go through this dark tunnel. And there was no street lights out there. It was pitch black. And then, I dreaded having to go through that foliage tunnel at night. So I would sprint through it, Pierre. I would run through it as fast as I could. Right. And so all this was going on in the weeks leading up to my going back to California. So fast forward, now I'm back in California. It's September 1990. And then within a period of just a matter of weeks, I had a number of ET experiences, close UFO sighting encounters. I had a gray alien looking out at me through my TV set, and coincidentally, in another part of the house, I'm presuming the same ET was looking out of my brother's TV at him. In order to test his reality, he punched his dresser, and he showed me the dent the next morning. Me, I was laying in bed asleep, and by then I was skittish again, so I fell asleep with the lights on, right? And back then, your viewers are old enough to remember, we didn't have this around-the-clock television saturation we do today. It was like, come a certain point in time, in America, they would play the national anthem, right? Sans the lyrics, they would just play the music. They would have the flag, waving, and then you would have the color bars, and then after a while, it would just turn to snow, right? That's what it used to be like. Anyway, there I am lying in bed with the lights on and the snow on the TV screen, and then after a while, this gray appeared in the snow of the TV screen, and it was doing something to my brain. It was like zap, zap, zapping me. I could feel it in my head, right? And so there was a split screen in my mind. One part of my consciousness was in that room, conscious of the fact that this alien, for lack of a better term, was zapping me with some electrical energy out through my TV, or what seemed to be out of my TV. And then the other split screen was my younger brother in his room. He was wide awake looking at the same thing out of his TV. In order to test his reality, he punched his dresser. Now, what happened for me was, and this is a commonality amongst many alien abductees, they like to sleep with their bed up against a wall to kind of cover one of their flanks subconsciously, but it doesn't work because the ETs can open a portal and go through the wall. But anyway, I had my bed up against a wall. And when he punched his dresser drawer, it sounded as if he'd punched my wall. And I abruptly woke up. I immediately looked at the TV screen. Now it was just snow, right? Well, that's interesting. And just the paranoia and fear just intensifies at that point. And so what happened was the next morning, my younger brother kept looking at me funny, looking at me like in this accusing kind of, hostile state. And finally, I had to ask him, well, why are you tripping? Why are you looking at me like this? What did I do? And then out of him came the story that, he was in his bedroom and this alien was looking at him, and in order to test his reality, he punched his wall. What I just told you. Yeah. I said, well, yeah, I understand. I didn't tell him what happened to me. But I said, why are you blaming me for this? How do I enter into this picture? But somehow, at some unconscious level, he felt I was connected, hence I was somehow responsible, right? Okay, that was one experience. And then a couple of weeks later, I woke up. Long story, I've told this in other podcasts, but I woke up, there were 3 reptilian grays in my bedroom. Now, by that point, for whatever reason, I slept either with the lights off or these beings had turned off the lights themselves. So I woke up, and there were 3 reptilian grays in my bedroom, one right next to me, one at the foot of the bed, and one by the bedroom door. That same door, I had to take off the hinges that time, right? And the one closest to me said to me in the language of the vernacular, clear as a bell, telepathically, go to sleep, you're just having a nightmare. Nightmare, yeah, right. So I was already immobilized. I could only really move my head. I couldn't move the rest of my body. So I turned my head to that wall just so I didn't have to look at this being anymore, After a while, I looked back, they're still there. And then a little while later, they brought in this female hybrid being. Things just kind of unraveled from there. They took me up to their ship, and things really kind of went off the rails. So the next morning, and it was funny because I told my buddy that his car was in the shop. So he couldn't drive his car to work, and I didn't have to go to school at the time because I was going to university. I was going to school, but I was also working shift work at night, right? I think it was around that time frame, might have been. Anyway, I told him since I had the morning free, I'll pick him up, right? Now, unbeknownst to me, his entire street was scheduled for a street sweeping clean by those street sweepers. So everyone on the street either had their cars in the garage or they had it parked in their driveway. So mine was the only car sitting in front of his house waiting for him to come out so I can give him a lift that morning. And that added to the sense of isolation and fear. And I'm sitting there replaying these events that happened the night before with these 3 reptilian greys. Finally, my friend comes out of his house, and the first words out of my mouth were, "I had a horrible nightmare last night." And I just kept repeating that over and over. I had a horrible nightmare. And so, again, as in the past, in order to gain some semblance of control, right? Because I also had a missing time experience where I woke up, my body was rigid, electrical currents running through it, parked perfectly in front of my house. That happened like a couple of weeks before that, now that I think about it. So all these things were happening, like crescendo events. And so I immersed myself in the books. I started going to this shopping center where there was a B. Dalton's bookstore. And I just started buying every single book I could find about alien abductions, and then going to the supermarket in my neighborhood, which I'd been to countless times. And to this day, if I walk into a used bookstore, if I walk into a secondhand store or whatever, I always make a beeline to see where the books are, right? And on this occasion, in this supermarket, I walked to where the books were, and there at head level was the book UFO Crash at Roswell, written by Donald Schmitt and Kevin Randall. Kevin Randall later morphed into a UFO alien abduction debunker. Go figure. But Donald Schmitt was the co-author, who has since wrote a couple of other great books about Roswell. Anyway, so I brought the book home, UFO Crash at Roswell, and I began reading about this clandestine military covert operation of a retrieval of an alien craft in New Mexico. And, reading it, because I so immersed myself in studies of military history, covert operations by that point, the transition in my mind was as simple as rolling over in bed. And so then I realized that there was a deep black military element to this. Then later on, I began working for Naval Air Force's U.S. Pacific Fleet because I'd moved to San Diego, California, became a part of the San Diego UFO Society, and began meeting with people that had an ex-military or intelligence background who likewise were interested in the subject, who had their own experiences. So that pretty much set me on my course. And then before too long, I realized that of all these abducting beings, it seemed to me, and I knew this at some innate level, that the reptilians were at the top of the heap. At least they were up there, right? One of the major players behind this. And I've since come to understand, thankfully, I had a mentor, Barbara Bartley, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. She since passed away. They tried to assassinate her, and it took a while for her to actually die. They played around with her blood pressure until finally she had a stroke and died. But that was like after they tried to kill her. So, and she really helped me to understand that this reptilian force had been here for a long time, was malignly influencing the human race, indeed had, for all intents and purposes, transferred all these through hybridization and through this long-term behavior modification process, transferred their most odious pathological characteristics into their hybrids, who became, first, way back when would have been the astronomer priest class, and then later on, through these fraternal orders and whatnot. And now you walk into any classroom in California or somewhere, the cultural Marxism, the insanity is just so in your face nowadays. So what they've managed to do, Pierre, as you know, is they've transferred, and Carlos Castaneda talks about this in his books, where his mentor, Don Juan Matus, said, they've given us their minds. And I can't think of a more brilliant way to describe this, because through their ability to manipulate the astral dreamscape, through their ability to inject thoughts and imagery, mental imagery into the minds of so many people, to subtly and not so subtly influence people, and through the genetic hybrid process ensure that their placemen and placewomen hybridize variants of themselves, which have a genetic predisposition of being taken up as a host when these reptilians are in their interdimensional non-corporeal form, and then place them in all the key positions of influence, in front of the camera, behind the scenes. And that's what we have now. There's this communist insurrection, this pandemic lockdown, are in-your-face examples of this reptilian overlordship. And you know, the proof is in the pudding. When they try to normalize things that we would find so heinous, you know, the pedophilia, all this other stuff that's going on, there's nothing remotely human about any of that. So, you know, basically bringing it up to the forward, to the present, and that's why I also look at things from a geopolitical standpoint as well, because I've studied military history, I've studied geopolitics, and when one looks at, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution, when one looks at the Mao's Great Leap Forward Cultural Revolution, which essentially was wiping out all vestiges of China's imperial past, et cetera, that's what we have today.
Yeah. This is fascinating. And again, I guess that there's different ways of looking at this, but I've certainly seen that through my research, that whatever is manipulating humans, that there is this manipulative element. And I think that they're very much concerned about control and exercising that control over humanity. So I think, again, that's something which is very indicative of the reptile and its psychology, this idea of control. And again, I think it's found within the cultural artifacts as well, the symbolism of the reptile, and in terms of also the human mind, in terms of how it's compartmentalized between the mammalian and the reptilian mind. Have these experiences continued right up to date, or did they stop at some point? Because with me, I've had experiences, but what tends to happen is that they'll happen over, well, basically, when I started to write The Murder of Reality, which would have been in around 2003, it took 7 years to write. When I made that conscious decision to write the book, really strange things started to happen. Like I'd started to see shadow beings. Have you seen shadow beings? Just out of interest, I know that.
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. In the first of my vision, I've seen a lot of different things.
Do you have an interpretation about the shadow beings?
I do believe, in my discussions with Jerry Marzinski and others, some people have gone in depth into the shadow beings, have gone in depth into the Hat Man phenomena, and I do believe that they represent, and I'm not saying that they represent a particular group or a particular type of being. They could represent a number of different beings, but there's some kind of being that is able to access our reality and remotely, well, not remotely, but subtly or not so subtly at times, influence us, malignly influence our behavior. So I think that they come into this general family, kind of umbrella organization of archontic beings that have this compulsion to malignly influence humanity. Some of the shadow beings, I would say, are reptilian in nature or other types of archontic beings. But the shadow beings themselves, I think that at least some of them may represent a distinct group, a phylum, if you will, a particular species, for lack of a better term, of interdimensional being. And a quick point I want to make about, you talked about language learning. Also, there's a great book by Leonard Susskind called the Alphabet versus the Goddess, or the Goddess versus the Alphabet. And the thesis of his book was, and it has everything to do with the way I interpret it, part and parcel of the destruction of the divine, feminine, divine mother aspect on Earth. So many of the First Nation cultures were the divine feminine was practiced, and then it was replaced over time, largely eradicated in many extreme examples, and replaced by this harsh patriarchy, right? Part and parcel of that was the removal of the symbol language of learning, which speaks to us at a soul level, and replaced by the alphabet language, which shunts us essentially into the left logical side of our brain. But unfortunately, with language learning, with language speaking, language alphabet, comes dogmas, comes creeds, comes laws, right? And so you can see how the astronomer priest and the ones who succeeded them were able to this day, where science has become more a religion than actual, science. So that was a key part of this, was the manipulation of language. Point now where everything has a highly emotive character, where people can't reason or debate reasonably anymore. Everything has a high emotive content, and that in itself shunts people into that lizard part of the brain.
Do you think that's to do with the Western tradition of the dialectic, of the dialogue between the argument and the counter-argument, in terms of fostering almost what is dualistic thinking? And I mean, do you think that's a constructive way to think in terms of breaking down arguments in arguments and counter-arguments? Is that part of the conditioning of the human mind? How do you view that?
Well, I believe at one time, and I think some of the First Nation cultures are still like this, or elements of them are still very telepathic, like the Aboriginals in Australia. Many of them still, amongst themselves, still speak telepathically, and I've spoken with people that have taken part in sweat lodges and whatnot, and it seemed to them that the Native American medicine men and women leading these sweat lodges were able to communicate telepathically, and they saw all kinds of powerful medicine inside those sweat lodges besides that. So the ability to transpose or interpose words and verbal utterances in place of direct thought transmission I think is a key part of this. It could be, for lack of a better term, where this Tower of Babel moment came at some point in our distant past, through manipulation, genetic manipulation of a neurology, of what have you. I think many of us have described spontaneous examples of telepathy or remote viewing. For some people that practice this sort of thing, it comes more natural to them. For the rest of us, like myself, it's more of a hit or miss kind of thing. When I really need to have a telepathic, intuitive capability, it just comes naturally at times. But I think that supplanting that telepathic mind-to-mind ability to communicate with this language alphabet system has really, really set back the human race. First of all, you have all the cultural differences and all these foreign languages, and then even within the English language, which has been so bastardized, it's just so difficult communicating with these social justice warriors, with these younger people that have been the products of this cultural Marxist communist indoctrination. And you might as well be speaking a different language, Pierre. There's no rational. Yeah, it's crazy.
Do you think we're seeing now this increased polarization, this accentuation in terms of viewpoints, where it almost seems like that there's a lot of people who are waking up, to use a better, for the want of a word, but then there's also people who are much more, shall we say, dogmatic and very entrenched in the old way of thinking. And I think that this is becoming very pronounced. Obviously, these antagonisms are being encouraged through the media. It's also not very much helped by the fact that we've got censorship. And obviously, when censorship occurs, then I become very suspicious, because this is what always happens in terms of totalitarianism. You see the censorship, particularly of the intellectuals as well. But because we're seeing intellectuals being censored, then this is actually very critical. And so I think that this is showing something which is very sinister, and we're moving into something which is very sinister. I do see that there are lots of people waking up to this, because we're moving into a system in which this has never been seen within the West before. And so it's becoming much more in your face. It's almost that people are anticipating something, but they don't quite know what is going to come next, but they sense that there's a feeling of potential malevolence, or that things could work out in a way which would not be very conducive for the well-being of humanity. And again, my understanding from studying the alien phenomenon is that they are obsessed about control, that they do intervene within human affairs. I mean, I describe this within my book, Holographic Culture. I describe this as a parallel society. And so they are interfacing with humanity. And so therefore, if we have this situation where the world is in lockdown, and we're seeing that systematically every single country is following the same protocols, then that does seem to me that there is this interference which is coming from this otherness, to use the want of a better word. And so I do think that this is playing out within the geopolitical landscape. Also, this is what I got very frustrated when I was speaking to ufologists. This idea almost that they're in the sky, but they would never, ever intervene within human affairs. It's almost like the Star Trek directive, and I think that that, in a sense, has been put there to condition this idea that these beings always remain passive. But when we look at ancient mythology, and we was talking about this earlier on, the gods are continually manipulating humanity. They are continually taking on different forms and creating new bloodlines and causing all kinds of problems. And so this is an ongoing story. I mean, how do you see this playing out? Are you an optimist? Do you think that people are going to begin to wake up, and is humanity going to begin to cooperate and work together to find common solutions? Or do you think that it's just going to go all pear-shaped before things can get better? Or have you given up on humanity? How do you see this?
I wouldn't say it's a case of every man or every woman for himself or herself, but I do believe that there seems to be a splitting of consciousness because of this shunting of so many people into the lizard part, the reptilian part of the brain, where they're highly reactive, highly emotive, dogmatic. The mentality harkens back to the Inquisition, to the witch hunts, where anyone who's described ironically as the demonic other, any form of punishment meted out to them is justified. Beatings and murders in the street because someone is too white, for example, and the media won't cover that at all because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? Because they are intent on creating a race war. There's been atomization at every level, fragmentation, every level. Destroy the family, destroy the culture. America and Europe, well, let's take America, for example. And we can all agree, here's a disclaimer I'm throwing out to begin with, we can all agree that the supplanting of the Native American population, the mass genocide of the Native American population was intrinsically a wrong. It was bad, right? There could have been another way to bring in the European traditions into America without wiping out the native population, right? But ultimately, who's responsible for that? It's the people or the hybrid beings who control these trading companies. East India Trading Company, the Africa Trading Company, the Hudson Bay, Virginia Trading Company, et cetera, et cetera. These charter companies, right, that are run by these international banking cartels. So, we need to put the focus on who's responsible for this instead of just the simplistic, well, it's whites oppressing blacks, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, got that disclaimer out of the way. But for the last 200 years, America has largely been traditionally, culturally, of European heritage. And that is being destroyed as we speak. London, the UK, Britain, historically has been this Celtic, Anglo, Gaelic tradition. That's been supplanted, right? That's been destroyed. And the control is such that were we to complain about it, I wouldn't say I get a free pass, but I can say a lot more than most because I'm not white, okay? But if a white person were to say this, well, they're just a bigot, they're just a racist, they're just an Islamophobe, a homophobe. I mean, it used to be where without going into specifics, okay? Particular ethnic cultures, particular demographics who played the victim-aggressor card to the hilt, right? To the point where any criticism, however justified, would just be met by an avalanche, a hailstorm of criticism from the media, from the universities, from everywhere. And what they managed to do as part of this control system is take that tactic and spread it out through all these different, made up, in many cases, demographics. And even if a given demographic, in our example, makes up a minuscule part of the population, like 2%, if that, then we have to look out for the interest of that 2% at the expense of everyone else. So gradually, we've been painted into a corner of what's acceptable to say, what's not acceptable to say. Right? And that's part of this control system, right? But anyway, I didn't mean to interfere, please.
Yeah, no, well, we're seeing this within British culture, this minoritization of white people. And I mean, my wife's Japanese, and she sees the same reflection in Japan. So again, there is this attempt to try and erode the Japanese sense of Japanese identity, because there's a strong cultural identity there. And they're trying to do that through integrating different ideas and different minorities. And again, it's that people aren't even allowed to discuss this. I guess when you're looking at nation states, that there are different ways of looking at this. You can have an integrative state, or even get rid of state borders, and that would be one way of structuring the world. Another way would be to have distinct nations and distinct ethnicities and cultures and languages. And I'm not saying that one way is right and another way is wrong, but we're not allowed to have this debate. And I actually think that it is a very legitimate debate. And I mean, I think that this is very important. People need to take responsibility in terms of what is occurring. And I think, again, that what is happening is that when you get these very strong distinctions, then people begin to feel alienated, and they alienate the other. And by alienating the other, this then leads to all kinds of horrendous crimes. And so that needs to be understood. And again, if you're going to have a multicultural society, then there needs to be a recognition that there has to be some type of integration. Because if there is no integration, then there is alienation. And with alienation comes the dehumanization of the human subject. And that doesn't really matter if you're white or black, because that's going to occur on both sides. But really, what we need to do is we need to recognize our humanity. And I think that this is important, because you reflected upon this earlier when you were saying that really it's these companies and these hierarchies which interface with this other element, with this parallel society. And they are the ones who are, if you like, filtering down the ideology and controlling how people think. And now, obviously, we have to be responsible and recognize and deconstruct what we think, and we have to be very careful about the thoughts that enter our head, and we have to, in a sense, try and understand, well, where are these thoughts coming from? Are these my thoughts? Is my thinking being affected? Because there is so much propaganda there, and I think that this is the problem, that we're suffering from collective cognitive dissonance because the information itself is contradictory. And I think that this is what they're doing. They're using contradiction to confuse people and also to make them feel dissonant and ambivalent and indifferent. It's almost like that the human being shuts off when they become overloaded with information and they can't understand or process that information. Then there comes a point where they just stop even trying to attempt to understand what is occurring. And so I think that the manipulation is very sophisticated. It's doing what you're saying. It's causing division, and then it's using division in order to control. And what it's actually doing is making sweeping changes ideologically. And I think that what's very interesting is the amount that they're trying to change society is very radical. I mean, we saw this type of radical change within China, for example. And again, you saw dehumanization of the human subject through, well, first of all, they began to erode gender. So the men and the women would dress the same and they would look the same. And they got rid of this idea of gender distinction because gender is a part of what it means to be human, and we express our identity through our sexuality. And again, even the language itself, whereas we would be talking about sex as in male and female, now we've moved to gender, which is the grammatical explanation of male and female, and now that is inferred through language. So again, the language itself is being rewritten, and even when you look at dictionaries which are just a decade old, you're seeing that the definitions are changing. So they're rewriting the dictionaries. And so they're rewriting the ideology, they're rewriting the language, and they're doing this through, obviously, through neuro-linguistic programming. So we're in, well, I'm going to say uncharted territory. Really, we're not, because these kind of systems have played out before multiple times. But we are in a very precarious, this is a very precarious time. And so we need to be very mindful in terms of our actions and our actions impact, and in terms of what we can do as well. Because I think a lot of people feel very disempowered. And I feel that people need to take action. I'm not necessarily saying take direct action, but action in their own lives, meaningful action, and in order to empower themselves. So even if they're feeling, well, what can I do? There is always something that an individual can do, whether it's something just very simple like posting leaflets, or being engaged, or talking to other individuals and trying to ignite a spark, and just to, or ignite a sense of community. Or if there's some kind of law which is wrong, then challenging that through the legal system. So yes, I think we need to really begin to engage with the system. This is very important, and we need to engage with it at many different levels, and we need to begin to empower ourselves as well through our actions, and to be very mindful. So is there anything that you would like to finish on, or is there something else that you would like to discuss?
I'd like to finish answering your question. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent, roundabout terms, but as far as what I see coming down the track, right? I see a splitting of consciousness, and although I would like to see humanity at large overcome all this, for lack of a better term, there seems to be an attrition rate at work, because Bernard Gunther and his partner Laura Matsu talk a lot about this, these traps of agreement, these soul entrapments that can happen lifetime over after lifetime, where people, through consciously or unconsciously or under duress, whatever the case may be, they make these binding promises, for lack of a better term, to these non-human beings who control things from, the unseen realms, essentially. And that's what's happening when people are taking the knee. That's what's happening when people voluntarily put the mask on, again, under duress. But we're looking at things from an individual and a collective perspective. If people want to move away from that narrative and live in their own bubble and create their own harmonious sanctuaries for themselves, they have a leg up as far as not only their own physical, mortal survival, but as far as the ultimate disposition of their soul. And it's a gradual process of divesting ourselves and detaching and doing away with whatever agreements we made with these archontic beings in past or parallel incarnations, or in our current incarnation. Because, you go to a government website and, the button that you click says submit, right? It's like, well, I just want to submit a form, or I want to submit a claim, or it says submit. It doesn't say enter here. It says submit. And so the word, the language play itself, as you pointed out, has been weaponized. It has been weaponized, right? So we must understand the level of consciousness where this control is coming from. So many of these hybridized elites, so-called, lack of a better term, they're Luciferians. In the old days, it was quite normal to think of these non-human beings, non-human life forms, in mystical terms, in occult terms, and all that. Of course, as you know, all occult means is that which is hidden, right? It gradually becomes known to the initiates through a phased process. Well, these hybridized elites, they're, for lack of a better term, Luciferians. They take part in all these arcane ceremonies and rituals. And oftentimes in some of these rituals, depending on their nature, and some of them could be quite horrific by any normal standard, can result in the manifestation, appearance, or conjuring of non-human life forms. And these ceremonies and rituals tend to take place in locations which are high energy vortex areas where the membrane, the veil, if you will, between worlds is very thin. So it makes it very easy for these entities to show up, and it also makes it very easy for those who have a genetic predisposition to shapeshift into one of these beings. And the concept of shapeshifting goes down through antiquity. So many of these different cultures describe shapeshifting in one form or another. So that is the conduit through which these indoctrination programs, all this division and all this manipulation is taking place, because they put their placemen and placewomen hybridize variants of themselves who have a apparently human face in all these key positions of power. And so they've very much created this world for themselves. It's a large animal farm, a huge terrarium, and they have no respect for the planet. They're systematically destroying the planet. Then they have the gall, the audacity to spin everything around and saying, because we're leaving a huge carbon footprint, we're the ones responsible for all this. Everything is an inversion in our reality. So what we need to do as much as possible is to recognize the nature of the multi-threat reality we're in. Acknowledge its presence, its various manifestations, but not get caught up in the hopelessness and despair and futility of it all. Because if you look at it in historical terms, historical parallels, you know, these people back in the day that were on the verge of the Hunnic invasions or the Mongol invasions, they'd look at us and say, you guys got it easy compared to what we've got to go through. Okay, because, you know, worst case scenario for us, it's like, it's not even we get killed, it's like our family gets split apart and we're sold off as slaves, right? So, you know, when one looks at it in those stark terms, or you look at the horrific, what really just happened post-World War II, where Soviet Red Army just came in from the east and just the Western armies were stood down intentionally and allowed the Soviet Red Army to move into Eastern and Central Europe, and just created the Warsaw Pact and all the horrific abuse they meted out to the locals, particularly the women and young girls, right? That was literally a hellstorm, which hardly anyone talks about today. So, and what happened with the Cultural Revolution in China, hundreds of millions of people, lives extinguished, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like the human race has been subject to this level of predation before, but what we're seeing, what makes it unique this time around, is it's happening globally. And so that is a strong indicator, as you know, that there's global control force at work. And it's this Luciferian force that's working through the schools, working through all the institutions. And we just have to look at things when they keep pushing certain memes and certain narratives in our face. What I found, the easiest thing to do is just stand it on its head. What's really going on, right? Why are they making such an issue out of these topics and these issues? Well, it all has to do with control. So when we realize, as David Icke says, we are multidimensional infinity, that encoded within our very DNA is the means to break out of this paradigm. And I'm not talking about a mass prison break, because unfortunately, because of all these traps of agreement, because so many people have already knuckled under and essentially given their minds away, realistically, I don't see, and I don't want to say this in callous terms, but from that perspective, I don't see much hope for a lot of these people that go along with this narrative, because the path of least resistance is to go along with whatever the prevailing narrative rather. And like water, which gets dropped off at its lowest point, that's what's going to happen to all these people that just go along with whatever the government wants, whatever the prevailing narrative is. No different than bison being run off a cliff, right? So there's going to be a large attrition rate at work. And one thing I should point out also before we finish here is our solar system is subject to celestially driven cataclysms. It's embedded within the lore of just about every First Nation culture on Earth. And we are on the cusp, once again, of these celestially driven cataclysms. And the controllers of this world, who, as we know, are non-human, they know very well this timetable. So they want to put all their pieces in play. They want to make this power grab now while they have the means to do it, because their variables may start to come into play. And we're already starting to see, Pierre, where it seems to me like they're making big mistakes, right? They're doing things that are having a boomerang backfire effect. Not everyone's going to benefit from it. Those who will benefit from it are those who recognize that at some level, at least, they don't have to know what we know. And I don't mean this in an elitist sense, that there's this reptilian overlordship umbrella over a lot of this, essentially non-human. But at least if they know at the surface level that there is a globalist agenda at work run by Luciferians, but it should dawn on them at some point that these Luciferians are worshiping something other than humans, right? At some point you would think that the coin would drop. And I think that is a major stepping stone. If people in the larger truth community, they take it as a given now that the elite indulge in all kinds of horrific things, which goes back in antiquity as far as human sacrifice and whatnot is concerned. But if they can recognize that these elite aren't entirely human, and if they can just look back in antiquity, and there's countless examples of this. Alexander the Great was apparently the spawn between the union of his own mother and Zeus in the form of a serpent. That's what the story is, right? One of the guy who wrote the 10 Caesars, he described Julius Caesar, as being the spawn between his mother and an incubus being, right? And this is what we've been talking about all along. This, these Nephilim beholding the fair daughters of men decided to take them on as their wives and begat children with them, and these became men of great renown. This hybridized astronomer priesthood elite, which has been running things covertly and now in your face, right? Because some of the pathologies and psychopathy manifested by these elite on TV, the gaslighting, the globalized, televised gaslighting that's going on, where they're pushing their insanity into our faces and making it seem like we're the crazy ones for not going along with their insanity. That's how bad it is. And if people haven't already seen the movie, they need to watch They Live, that movie by John Carpenter, which is a very good movie. And they need to watch Idiocracy, because what's happened with the human race and how it's been dumbed down, and how what's been described as linguistic minimalization, where people just don't have strong vocabularies anymore, right? Like I've been told, I don't think I talk in a wordy, verbose, pretentious way, but people have said, wow, you use a lot of big words. I go, not really. I don't really use a lot of big words, right? But it may seem that way to someone when you look at the books and the textbooks given to these kids in the schools these days. It's been really dumbed down. I mean, really dumbed down.
Yeah, I want to interject there, because when I was a teacher, what I was finding, and particularly within the scientific textbooks as well, was that they started to introduce street language.
Jargon, yes.
Jargon, yeah, into the textbooks. And so, again, when you're dealing with science, which uses very specific language, but yet that's being eroded, then that actually interferes with the ability to understand the discipline. And I mean, even my son, he's a voracious reader, but he said to me, Dad, in the last decade, the books have just got terrible. And most of the books that he reads are about from the 1950s onwards, because he just says that a lot of the recent children's books are just terrible. And so I think we are seeing that there is this dumbing down. And I think also that we're seeing this polarization, and we're seeing that these differences are being purposely played. I also see that children are being conditioned through the media. Again, the erosion of male and female and of sexuality. And again, the fragmentation of the family, which is also propagated and is reinforced through law, which encourages people to get divorced, and it encourages this antagonism between the mother and the father, which then has a very negative impact upon the child. So we're seeing all of these. It's very systematic and it's very calculated. So we are seeing that. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I do see that people are beginning to wake up and to question what is happening. It's almost that now we're getting to the stage that a lot of people are saying, well, yeah, this is curious and this is very, very odd. Why is the government behaving in the way that they're behaving? And more people are beginning to question that. And so, yeah, I am optimistic. I've got a friend, my webmaster, and he used to interact with beings, and he said that he doesn't have distinct memories of what they look like. He said that they look like a television screen, so like what you were describing, the snow on a television screen. And he said that these beings told him that in his lifetime things would get really, really bad, but that humanity would come out at the other end and then things would get really good, and he would see that towards the end of his life where things would, if you like, the balance would be restored again. So I mean, I'm optimistic. I do think that people will begin to see through what is occurring and they will begin to engage with it, and I think that this is important. I think that it's important that we just don't just sit there and just passively acquiesce, but that we engage with what is occurring. And it doesn't have to be in your face, overt engaging with it. It can be very discreet. And I think also sometimes the most strongest way of interacting with a force, which is essentially secretive and covert, is to be covert oneself. You know, there are different ways of actually engaging with what is occurring. But I would certainly encourage people to try and what I would describe as push back and to engage with that and to engage with the peer group and to try and wake people up. This is very important that people wake up, because as soon as they wake up, then it's much more difficult to manipulate and to control people. So this is important, and I think therefore it's important that we ourselves try to engage with the audience and try to get people to wake up. So I'm optimistic. I do think that we will come out of this, and we'll come out of this. I'm not saying that we're going to come out with a utopia, but I do think that the balance will be restored. And I think that humanity has been very imbalanced for a long, long time. When we see the systematic wars and the division, although potentially this could be very terrible for humanity, this is potentially something which could radically change humanity, but in a way which is very positive and very conducive for the development of humanity and for the balance. I do think that humanity can come out at the other end much stronger.
Yeah, just very quickly, I would like to add, I don't want to negative spin on this. I likewise think that humanity will come out of this okay. I mean, we've been subject to celestially driven cataclysms, civilizations have come and gone, and humanity is always, and you know, the land masses have been repopulated with animals and life forms, so that will come about again. And I do believe we're, like I said, they've been making a lot of mistakes, and I think a lot of people are starting to wake up. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you this morning, Pierre. Thank you so much, and thank you for your great work too. By the way, many of the people in our field hold you in the highest esteem for the work you've done.
Well, thank you for the compliment, and likewise I hold you in very high esteem as well. I think your research into the reptilians and also into the MyLab and the deconstruction of that, what I like about your work is that it's highly intellectual, and I think that we need, I don't want to sound elitist, but I do think that there's been a psyops, there's a psychological operation to try and keep the intelligentsia out of this subject, and they do that through delegitimizing the subject and making it seem as though it's just crazy people or it's conspiracy.
Yes, and almost merging it with the pop culture, which we saw with Japan, with the importation of so much of Americana, so much of the pop culture.
So likewise, so I just want to thank you also for your work and for your contribution, and yeah, just continue with the good work, and thank you very much for spending the time to speak to me and to engage in this dialogue. Hopefully we can speak again. I wish you well, and I wish your family well as well. Thank you very much.
Likewise, good fortune to you and your family. Thank you very much, and you take care, Pierre.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.